Hello and welcome to episode number 244. This is the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com and I am Cornelius Fichtner. Nice to have you with us. The projects we lead are all about a group of people delivering benefits to others. So it's no surprise that the human element is fundamental to project management. Lindsay Scott is one of the editors of the Gower Handbook of People in Project Management, which is advertised as a complete guide to the human dimension involved in projects. It's a compilation of over 60 chapters about project management roles and the people who sponsor, manage, deliver, work, or are otherwise important to project success. This episode is sponsored by the Agile Prepcast. Are you a project manager and want to become PMI-ACP certified? Then the easiest way to do so is with our sister podcast, the Agile Prepcast, and study for the exam by watching the in-depth exam prep video training from agileprepcast.com. I invited Lindsay to come on the program today and discuss 3 of the chapters in the book. You can look forward to not only her review of the chapters, but to a lot of takeaways that you can hopefully apply on your projects tomorrow. We discussed the chapters on international projects, cross-cultural relationships, and managing people in virtual organizations. And now please look around you. Those are the people on your project. Enjoy the interview.
The Project Management Podcasts feature interview.
Today with Lindsay Scott, Director of RS People.
Hello, Lindsay, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hello, Cornelius. It's nice to be here. Thank you very much for the invite.
Oh, we're happy to have you. So you and Dennis Locke edited the Gower Handbook of People in Project Management. How did the idea for the book first form for you?
It came because Gower, the publishers, had already actually got 2 handbooks already. They've got the Handbook of Project Management, the Handbook of Program Management, and of course they were thinking about, well, what's missing. And I think over the years, people have talked a lot more about the people side of project management, the more behavioural bits of project management. And I think they felt that it was that there was probably a handbook there, and they were right. There's certainly a handbook there.
Yes. So how did you find all the various contributors, and how many are there?
There's just over. I think it's about 51. When some of the chapters have been written by 2 people, so just over 50 contributors. And I basically found them. I mean, I suppose the way that the partnership between me and Dennis got put together was that Dennis is very much a person that is been an author in project management for a number of years, and is an incredibly great editor as well, which is what this book really needed. So that was very much his specialism. And I think I got approached because I seem to know a lot of people. I suppose I'd been around on Twitter for a while and social media and things like that. But also part of my business, part of the work that I do, I interact with a lot of practitioners as well. So I suppose for me, because I'd met a lot of people along the way, when we were thinking about the subject matter of people, straight away I was able to really, think of I would say probably about 50% of the book, I could probably think of people straight away. The other 50%, it was good finding out. I had a lot of great conversations with people all over the world, trying to find, some authors for some of the more trickier chapters. So yeah, it's just I suppose I got approached because of my network.
All right. And when did you first realize that the book was going to be this huge?
I think we got warned beforehand because I'd seen the other side of the handbook, so I knew that we were pretty much going to have to, the book would be that big. But actually, what's more interesting is that our book is slightly bigger than the other 2. So I think once you get into the process, actually you start to get a bit concerned that it's getting too big. So size, we weren't too worried about that because we knew that we'd got well, if you ask anybody, if you think about people in project management, what could you write about? I'm sure a lot of people will come up with so many great chapters as well.
Right. Yeah, and what we want to do for the rest of this interview, you have selected, handpicked 3 chapters from the book: international projects, cross-cultural relationships, and then also managing people in virtual project organizations. And we want to go through these chapters, talk a little bit about the content of the chapter, and most of all, we want to end each chapter with your takeaways, with your tips and tricks that people can apply on the projects tomorrow based on what the authors have to say in your book.
Okay.
So we're starting out with chapter 11, international projects. Tell us a little bit the gist about this chapter.
Okay, I think, the reason why I picked these 3 particular chapters, I thought, the podcast being an international and a virtual, podcast, I thought, it's probably a great collection. But the international project ones I particularly picked out, and also the cross-cultural relationships ones, actually written by the same person, which is Jean Binder, and I hope that I've got that pronunciation right. But Jean's from France, and I particularly liked these more of the international chapters, mainly because me personally, I'd never worked on an international project, so I actually found a lot of the ways and things that Jean was actually writing about, it was all new to me. So basically what he talks about in this particular chapter is more about if you're working on global or international projects, these are some of the additional things that you need to think about as a project manager over and above what you would quite possibly do if your project team was nearby or you were all located in the same country. So, for me, I found it really interesting.
He starts out by talking about traditional, distributed, international, and virtual projects. What's his definition there?
His definition, he actually says that the global and virtual projects in some ways are actually the same. But for him, you've got where the traditional projects where you are co-located, where you're one organisation, one project team in a single place. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to manage. But then when he starts to talk about the more of the global or international projects, that's where the virtual also comes into that. Because, ultimately the project teams are distributed around the world. And really he gets into, for organisations, and also for project managers, but basically for organisations, they have to make that decision and get that balance right between do they go for a global project versus do they keep it traditional in that it's in one place. And he talks about actually if you go more global, the chances are that you get quite a lot more innovation on your projects because you're gathering together probably the best team that you can. Whereas if you were to have it in one country, one part of the world, or in one organisation, your resources might be quite limited and probably not necessarily the best people for the job.
He has a chapter in there, to be or not to be global. Does this chapter by any chance contain sort of selection criteria that tell us and help us to decide whether or not we should go global?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's he does go into a proper list of checklists against the pros and also the cons or things that you need to be looking out for. So, again, like I said, it's about having to have access to some of the right people for the project. He also talks there about actually you've got reductions in costs, especially in terms of things like space, being able to travel and things like that. However, a little bit of the cultural stuff starts to come into this chapter because he talks obviously about being able to adapt the project based on the different people that are involved in the different countries. There's obviously things like language difficulties. He also talks about some of the more behavioural stuff, things like building trust and how do you manage conflict in your projects when actually you're all dispersed, you're global, and it's virtual.
Yeah, and then he gets really into the meat of it with the next 2 chapters that titled How to Manage Global Projects and Collaborative Tools and Techniques. And this is where it starts to get really interesting for me. So how do you manage global projects? What does he say?
He says that, essentially he has got a framework that he's pulled together And the framework is called the Global Project Management Framework, and it has 25 areas which basically act as a reminder almost about the types of requirements that you need to consider. So, for example, one or two or three of those requirements would be that if you've got a global project, as a project manager, you need to be looking at trust building. It's going to have to be a key area about how or what are you going to be able to do that allows you to build trust in this global project that you're managing. So yeah, that's quite a difficult thing. But it also has got some more practicalities of stuff, which is, well, what global project structures are we going to use? What kind of processes, tools, things like that we're also, everybody's going to need access to those. But so what are they going to be? They've got to be able to work for everybody. So there's the practicality side of running the project, but, it's talking again about things like, how do we get the best out of people that are working from a creativity point of view? How do we manage that? So if we have, a project team in America, one in Japan, one in the UK, how can you possibly get the best out of those individual teams? So it's pointing at the framework is helping you to. These are some of the typical areas that have been known to be sticky points on global projects.
Mm-hmm. Do you have some examples of the collaborative tools and techniques that he recommends?
Collaborative tools and techniques, he doesn't really go into that kind of detail. So we just talk about things in terms of global methods, thinking about things like, if you're all going to use like the standard of PMBOK, for example, PMI's PMBOK, but it doesn't go into detail about things like the tools that specific branded tools or things like that, but it's more about thinking about, for example, when he talks about knowledge sharing tools, they need to think about content management systems where things are going to be able to be captured, but are also going to be able to be easily published. He talks about knowledge sharing tools, but not about branded things. He talks very much about the concepts of, so, for example, the need for things like a content management system where they'll be able to share project news and status and things like that. So again, it doesn't matter if that particular country might be it might be in the middle of the night. They're able to very quickly catch up with what's going the next morning when they all get up. So it's just, there's various bits and pieces in there about the use of audio and video technology, but it's just stressing really that it needs to be basic. It needs to be basic tools, because often if you are getting started on a project, you want to crack on with the project. You want to make sure that the infrastructure of your project in terms of the things like the processes and what have you are pretty much already there. So you don't want to be having to invest a lot of time in getting some kind of technical platforms sorted out so you can do your status reporting better. So it's very much about keeping it very simple.
All right. Overall, what's your takeaway? What is your recommendation to our listeners from this chapter? What should they be doing?
I think for me, like I said, I'm quite a novice in this area, but I saw a lot of value in the framework, because I think often with this kind of thing, project managers are by and large experienced people. They know how to manage projects, and the framework is not about spoon feeding in terms of this is how you do global projects. It's more of a okay, yes, of course, that makes sense. It's just thinking differently about the way that you manage your project as you upscale it to, involve more countries, more people from different cultures.
All right, we're moving on to chapter 24, Cross-Cultural Relationships, also written by Jean Binder. Give us your take on that chapter.
Again, I picked this one because part of my background is that I studied psychology. So, the people stuff is one of the things that really, really interests me. And again, because of my, never really done global projects, I really like the idea of trying to understand how culture starts to impact on projects. I was quite surprised by this chapter, actually. I didn't know what to expect when he came back with it, but I ended up loving it because, essentially he starts off, well, what is culture? We've got to try and define that before we can start to try and understand how it will affect us in our projects. I don't know if you've got any, if you'd like me to talk about a definition of I think one of the things that stood out for me in this particular chapter is he talked about how culture is often represented as icebergs with their hidden and visible features, or as onions representing the different layers or levels of depth of cultural manifestations. And the bit that I thought was pretty good in terms of the visible layers. So if you imagine that you're working in a project where you have many cultures, and that could just be, one project, one organization where you're bringing together employees from different parts of the world. He talks about being manifested by things called symbols, heroes, and rituals. Now, what he means by that, he talks about, well, in terms of people from different parts of the world, often have certain words or gestures about, the way that they speak about things. They also have heroes. So this is people that, in their folklore, for example, or in their historical context of their country or whatever else, they have what's called local heroes. And then, of course, people have rituals as well, which, again, is a very cultural thing. And what Jean goes on to do is just think, well, how could this manifest itself in projects? And basically, it would say, example for project management, the symbols side of it is how they translate maybe specialist terms on the project, or their techniques, or the way that they do diagrams, for example. With the heroes, it's more about it's who is their hero within the workplace, and what he means by that is who is it that has an impact on that person's career. So who is it that influences their advancing in their career? Who gives them rewards and so on, who are some of the more popular team members and things like that. And then finally, their rituals. And I think most people will be very aware of certain business rituals around the world. But again, this kind of stuff manifests itself in things like the way that teams organize themselves, but also how even things right down into things like the meetings and how people often defer to, leaders, or, some cultures, meetings and things like that can be fraught with many different types of behavior going on.
He also talks about the need to avoid generalizations when it comes to culture and project management. What does he tell us here?
He talks about probably things that most people would automatically think about when you do think about things like stereotyping. There are the obvious things. So, regions. So if you're in a particular part of the world, or a particular city even, it's which part of a city do you come from? You see, stereotyping going on at that micro level. But at a bigger scale, it's things like ethnic origin, religion, language, gender, age, education levels, those kind of things. Those are the generalizations. So there's nothing really probably new to most people there. But what is interesting is that when you then start to look at some of what he calls cultural dimensions, for example, I'll give you one of the cultural dimensions he talks about, which is something called power distance. And it's about how, well, let me just read this little bit to you. It says, this dimension reflects how individuals from different cultures handle the fact that people are unequal, and how the project stakeholders are likely to be involved in the decision-making process. Now, what she's talking about is that some team members from certain countries with a larger power distance rate may find it very difficult to disagree with their project managers in front of other people, compared with individuals from countries that have a smaller power distance rate. Now, what you're then doing is thinking about, so these are cultural dimensions, and then on top of that, you have these generalizations, so this stereotyping that goes on based on age, sex, and so on. So that's what's the really interesting thing for me about this chapter, that's bringing something new, and is certainly something that a project manager that is either working with different cultures today or potentially in the future, I think it brings a lot more thought to it, or a lot more insight into perhaps what you already may think about, cultural differences.
He then moves on to talk about building on the richness of a multicultural team, where he talks about cross-vergence and hybridization. What's that all about? It's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is. And, this is not my area of expertise, so I hope I'm doing Jean justice here. But But basically, cross-vergence, it's these two things are recent research, which is what, the book was all about, trying to bring more, traditional management things, that have already been out there for a number of years, and then bringing in something that was quite new. But cross-vergence is about the fusing together of management practices of two or more cultures. It's saying that, for example, global teams can provide all the elements for an effective fusion of different project management practices, people from various countries and company cultures, enriched by different experiences and management theories, implemented by a team in different countries with a wealthy mix of skills and beliefs. So it's also talking about I suppose the other word that we often hear, which is the melting pot. And I think that the cross-vergence is pretty much, is that. It's the melting pot. Whereas the hybridization is another concept on the multicultural management, which can be defined as the use of a common body of knowledge, enhanced with selected parts of successful practices from the countries where the project is being put together, or from the team member's original culture. And I think that's probably, if we're taking a lot of organizations these days have their project management methods, processes, generally coming from either professional bodies or organisations that are influential in that particular region or country, it stands to reason that individuals are going to be changing those processes or methods to suit, the people that are actually working on the project. And I think we find that quite possibly all over the world, because it certainly does happen in the UK.
Okay, so on this chapter, what is your takeaway here? What is your recommendation to our listeners, how they can apply this on their projects?
I think, again, the takeaway, like I said, I think is delving down deeper into this subject. If this is something that's going to affect your career, that you are going to be managing projects in this way, I think one of the things that I took away from this chapter is that, cultures are obviously got to be valued and respected, but equally, is finding that balance between you as the project manager is leading and trying to pull this team together. There's probably a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of team exercises to try and bring those people together. But ultimately, what Jean does on this chapter is says that ultimately the project manager has got to respect those different values of a country, of different cultures. However, at the end of the day, the project manager is there to do a job, which is to lead that project successfully as well. So it's about finding the balance. But I think in order to be able to find a balance, you kind of need to understand a little bit more about what culture actually is.
All right. And from here, we're moving on to Chapter 12, Managing People in Virtual Project Organizations. Again, what's the gist of the chapter? What is your take here?
Okay, gist of the chapter, virtual projects, is about, projects, team members that are dispersed. And again, it's slightly different to international projects and global, because it doesn't necessarily have to be people dispersed in different countries. It also, most people, if they're in a particular country, they might find, well, especially here in the UK, that you might have project team members that member based in the north of the country, others at the south, still within the same country, but the travel and what have you is still a little bit difficult. And equally, it's the virtual thing is a little bit more of a chapter that is focused on, I suppose, a lot more of the practicalities of how you're managing projects virtually. So the author, Penny Pullen, has had a number of years' experience in this area. She gives some great practical insights and tips around how you manage meetings, for example, in a virtual project.
She starts out the chapter with examples of virtual project teams. What are some examples that she gives us?
I suppose, apart from the one that I just mentioned, where you've got basically one company, but it's, one country with lots of different sites, I think, that's another one. But also virtual projects where, for example, more organizations are coming together. So she particularly pulls out some case studies that talk about several companies, not only public sector organizations, but private together as well. So projects that are using different organizations that are collaborated. And then, of course, she talks about some examples on the scale of spread over 4 continents.
Okay. Then she moves into talking about the virtual project teams and, as you mentioned, virtual project meetings. Let's take a look at her take on the virtual project teams. What does she teach us here?
setting up a virtual project team. Penny focuses very much on the power of the kickoff of a project. She totally advocates that you should have a kickoff meeting which aims to bring those people together face to face in the same place. And that may only be the only time that those people are together in one place, depending, of course, on the length of the project. But she thinks it's crucial to be able to do this, because when you look at some of the downsides of virtual projects, I mean, one of the things, again, like the global projects, this thing about building up team spirit, building up trust, things like that, is so difficult to do if people are just hearing a voice on the other end of the phone. So a lot of it is about that initial putting together of that team and making sure they do that, right at the beginning of the project.
Right. And then what about the virtual project team meetings? I have a ton of virtual project team meetings every week, so tell me what I'm doing wrong.
I think it is an interesting subject, because basically after the kick-off meeting where you've set in the tone of the project, virtual projects rely so much on the coming together and the meetings. One thing that I really liked about this particular chapter, well, was actually quite a lot of things, but one of the things that I'd never really thought of before was something called the time and place grid, which was about looking at some of the different technologies, but also recognizing that actually we can do more than teleconferences. I think a lot of people groan when you're going to have a teleconference, because they can be pretty dreadful. But she talks about the time and place grid, which I'll just run you through. There's 4 different types. So she talks about same time, same place. That's traditional meetings. That's when you can get together face to face. Same time, different place. Those are our dreaded teleconferences. But she also goes to talk about, video conferencing, online meetings are becoming more and more popular, instant messaging, text messaging, and even this thing called Second Life, which is an interesting concept. I'd like to think that some people around the world might be actually doing that on a project, but it's certainly interesting. Everyone's different time, same place is having something like a project war room or some kind of shared displays in an office. And then a different time, different place. So these are the things that if you've got people, literally scattered around the world where one half of the globe's awake and the other's asleep, it's things like the emails, doing some kind of recordings, discussion forums, getting the best out of social media, and things like blogs, wikis, and things like that. So again, I think for project managers, a practical takeaway of this particular part of this chapter, I think it'd be interesting to see whether you can come up with and maybe be a bit more creative yourself in terms of, what can I do in these 4 little quadrants that, are going to be crucial for me to deliver this project successfully.
All right. So in closing, what would you say? Who is the audience of your book?
We had this discussion, and I have had it for the last, how many years it took to put this book together. It really does span from, literally anybody that is interested in project management. So if you're a practitioner that's experienced, you will get a lot out of this book, because there'll be some new bits. We guarantee there's some new bits in there that you will not have come across before, because we bring some of the more well-known stuff together with some more, advances. It's a book that we know that universities and colleges are going to take up, because it goes hand in hand brilliantly with we focus too much on the techniques of project management. This redresses the balance. Other than the students and also the practitioners, actually, it's a book that is useful for anybody that's into management of people, because that's what this book's all about. It's that it may be called a people in project management, but ultimately it is a management book all about people.
All right. Once again, the book is called The Gower Handbook of People in Project Management, published by Gower Publishing. It was written by 51 authors from around the world, and it's edited by Dennis Locke and Lindsay Scott. Lindsay, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you very much.
And that was Lindsay Scott reviewing 3 of the 63 chapters found in the Gower Handbook of People in Project Management. Are you PMP certified and want to earn 37 PDUs quickly and for less than $5 per PDU? That's no problem with the Agile Prepcast. It not only prepares you for your PMI ACP exam, but also qualifies for a ton of PMP PDUs. Log on at agileprepcast.com/PDU for the details. And that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. As always, you can find us on the web at pm-podcast.com. Please send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com, and when you write, please do tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. The amount of time required to complete a government project is precisely equal to the length of time already spent on it. Until next time.